In this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about some of the protections that the brain and central nervous system have in place. Because this is such an important organ in the body, we have many ways to help protect and make sure that the brain is able to function as it should. Here's a list of the different protecting mechanisms that we have in the brain. The first being the scalp and the skin. And then we have the skull and the vertebral column. And again, this is just protecting the central nervous system. Then we have something called meninges, we're going to look at, and then cerebral spinal fluid and the blood-brain barrier. So we're going to look at each of these in turn. The scalp and the skull, there's not too much to say about that. The skull is the bony structure that we've already talked about in chapter 5. And this protects this acts as a bony protectant of the brain. The skin of the scalp is also there to help protect. There isn't really anything between the scalp and the skull. You can see that the scalp is a very thin layer of skin, and then you have the bone of the skull here, and then we're going to have some layers called meninges. Meninges are membranes that protect the brain, and there's three main layers that we're going to look at. Okay, the first one is called the dura mater. This is the outermost layer, and it means hard mother is what this means. The dura mater is a double membrane, and the outer membrane of the dura mater forms the periosteum underneath the skull, and it's attached to the underside of the skull here, and they call this a periosteal. And then the other side of the other layer is called the meningeal layer, and that's the dura mater. So this acts as the first layer of protection. Next we have what's called the Arachnoid Mater, and this one means basically spider mother. And the reason they call this the Arachnoid Mater is there's these little fibers here, some thread-like extensions here that some people think look like a cobweb, and so they call this the Arachnoid Mater. And underneath the Arachnoid Mater we have what's called the Subarachnoid Space, as you can see here. So the Arachnoid Mater is drawn here as this purple layer here, and then you have this space between the Arachnoid Mater and the next layer, the Pia Mater, and this is called the Subarachnoid Space. And notice that the blood vessels here are running through the Subarachnoid Space. This is also where there's going to be cerebral spinal fluid. We have these sinuses here, the arachnoid velus, that extend out, and they are also involved in the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid, as we'll see here in just a minute. Okay, and last of all we have this Pia Mater. And the Pia Mater is it means soft mother or little mother, and this is the most inner meningeal layer. And notice that it is basically attached to the brain. It's hugging the brain's every curve. It goes down into the sulci, as it covers the brain, and this is a very inner layer. As you dissect the brain, you'll notice that the Pia Mater, you can't really detach the Pia Mater from the brain. It's held on there very well. And so we have all these protective layers of the skin, of the brain, of the central nervous system to help protect it. And these can become infected and become inflamed. If you've heard of meningitis, so meningitis is an infection of the meninges, where it could be bacterial, it could be viral, and these are very dangerous because these layers are right next to the brain, and if this infection gets into the brain, then that can be, of course, can be very dangerous. Brain inflammation they call encephalitis, and you don't want that to happen. So if the doctors are worried that meningitis is occurring, they can actually test the cerebral spinal fluid, the fluid that's surrounding the brain, and see if there's really anything going on, anything wrong. Next, let's talk about the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid is very similar to blood plasma. We'll talk about blood plasma in a couple chapters coming up, but mainly made up of water. The majority of plasma is made up of water, but there are some other nutrients and other things floating around in it. And so the cerebral spinal fluid is very similar to blood plasma, but there are some significant differences that that make it the cerebral spinal fluid. And so it actively has to be made, and it's made from the blood plasma. And it's formed in different places in the brain. And the cerebral spinal fluid is basically bathing the brain and the spinal cord in this fluid. It acts as a cushion, a watery cushion that protects the brain. So if you get hit in the head or in the spinal cord, this watery layer allows for some give so that your actual brain isn't hitting against your bones or getting hit. So you have a little bit of cushion here. And the other thing about cerebral spinal fluid is it's constantly circulating. So it's being built from the plasma, being made from the plasma, circulating around the brain and the spinal cord, and then it's being reabsorbed and returning to the blood. And so this is a always moving, constantly moving in fluid. As we looked at the parts of the cerebellum, the parts of the brain, we looked at what are called ventricles, which are these open spaces inside the brain. And so here this picture is showing these ventricles, and the cerebral spinal fluid is within these ventricles as well as surrounding the brain as a whole. Okay, so we have cerebral spinal fluid flowing around the brain. Then we have these lateral ventricles, which would be ventricles 1 and 2, which join into this third ventricle, which then goes down something called the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, and then down into the spinal cord. Okay, so these are actual openings, spaces inside the brain with this cerebral spinal fluid. And then this picture here from your book shows how the cerebral spinal fluid is constantly flowing around. So it's around the brain, it's flowing around the brain. It comes out the arachnoid velus into this space from the subarachnoid space through the arachnoid velus into the space around the skull, between the skull and the brain. And notice here's our ventricles here. Notice the flow here down into the spinal cord, and then we have this flow around. And so this is constantly moving around. Here's the choroid plexus here. The choroid plexus, this is where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced from, and it's coming out into the spaces to flow around. And then we have another choroid plexus up here in the inner ventricles as well. And so this is where it's being produced from the plasma, coming out of the blood into the brain, and then it's traveling around and then being reabsorbed. So that is the cerebral spinal fluid. The last protection the brain has is something called the blood-brain barrier. And this is dealing with the blood. So as the blood is flowing around the body, that's what brings all the nutrients, all the oxygen to all the cells in the body. The brain is no exception. It needs a lot of nutrients. It especially needs a lot of glucose. It's the most energy needing or wanting organ in our body. So it's constantly pulling in this glucose, getting the energy that it needs. And this comes from the blood. But the brain, because of its important function, there's a special barrier here called the blood-brain barrier that keeps out a lot of the things that are flowing around in the blood. So you're only able to get in certain things into the brain. So capillaries, these are the smallest blood vessels, smallest type of blood vessels that are in contact with every cell in the body. And normally the capillaries are very leaky. They allow a lot of things out of the blood, a lot of nutrients, and glucose, amino acids, the proteins flowing in the blood. They're released out of these capillaries into the area around the cells, so the cells can use these. But in the brain, we have very impermeable capillaries. They're connected very tightly together with tight junctions, so there's very small spaces. Some things can still get out, so especially glucose is able to make it out of the cap through these capillaries because the brain needs that glucose, and also essential amino acids can also get through very easily in water. But other things that are in the blood, such as toxins or waste like urea, non-essential amino acids, also any ions, especially potassium ions that can affect the functioning of the brain, they're not able to pass through, which is a good thing. So this blood-brain barrier is very selective in what gets into the brain because it has such an important function. There are some things, though, that can get through the blood-brain barrier, and they can't keep these things out. And some of those are fats and fat-soluble molecules. So if you remember when we talked about the plasma membrane, it's a lipid bilayer, and so because it's a lipid, fats are able to move through this lipid bilayer and into the brain. Also respiratory gases, in this case this is a good thing, so oxygen, CO2, they can move in and out of the brain with no problem. Here's an interesting one though, alcohol. So alcohol is definitely a harmful substance, especially to the brain, but the blood-brain barrier is not able to keep out the alcohol. And so that's why someone that gets intoxicated, that this alcohol flowing in their blood, gets into their brain, affects their cerebellum, which is which deals with balance and making sure that everything's working well, coordinating all the muscle actions, and then also your thinking and judgment and things like these are impaired by the alcohol. Also, nicotine is able to move into the brain, and then also anesthesia can also get through, and that can be a problem because that can affect the brain and its function. So that's the blood-brain barrier, its job, trying to keep things out, but sometimes things are able to get through. Let's talk a minute just about some of the things that can affect the brain as well. So we just talked about the cerebral spinal fluid. That cerebral spinal fluid has to be able to exit the brain and be reabsorbed. If it doesn't, if for some reason it's being kept inside the brain, it's not able to get out, that's going to start causing swelling in the brain. And as you can see here in this child, you can see the enlarged brain, the skull that has gotten a lot bigger because of the cerebral spinal fluid that's accumulating there. We call this hydrocephalus. In the case of this child, this isn't going to be as dangerous as an adult because the child's skull is not yet fused, and so it still is able to expand a little bit. And so where this becomes dangerous is because if the cerebral spinal fluid starts to accumulate and it can't drain out and the skull is there holding it in, it starts to exert pressure on the brain and can start to impair brain function. So in this child here, because that skull is able to expand, you're not creating as much pressure on the brain, and so if they can take care of this will be okay. In an adult where your skull isn't able to expand, that can be a lot more dangerous. Other things that can happen in the brain, a concussion, which you've heard, you may have had experience with, often happens with football players, and this is when you have a slight brain injury, usually not permanent damage. You can have something called a contusion as well. In the case of contusion, this is actually having tissue destruction, and this can really be a problem. It can cause comas. It can cause a loss of consciousness for extended periods of time, or perhaps even a lifetime, if depending on what part of the brain is affected. So contusion can be very dangerous. And there's something called a cerebral edema, and what's happening here is the brain is starting to swell because of inflammatory response. And this is interesting because someone may have a brain injury, but they may be alert after it happens and they may seem fine, but then they start to digress and things start to get really bad. They may go into a coma thereafter. And so it's kind of a delayed response because this hemorrhaging is building up. And this can be very bad because this edema, this pressure can cause brain tissue damage. Then of course there's something that we've probably all had some experience with in people that we know, and this is the cerebral vascular accident, or what we call a stroke. And what's happening here is some blood vessel within the brain has ruptured, and that can either be caused by let me back up a little. So what's happening is the blood going to the brain has been blocked, and that can either happen because of a ruptured blood vessel or because of a clot. And that clot can come from different places within the body. It may not have formed in the brain, but as it travels through the circulatory system, the cardiovascular system, it may get lodged in the brain. And once that blood is cut off from the brain, it doesn't take very long before the tissue starts to die because of the oxygen has been lost. And this can be very dangerous depending on what happens or how long ago. You don't have very much time from when the stroke occurs to brain damage occurring. But depending on the part that is affected, which side of the brain is affected, and things like that, it's going to determine the extent of this stroke, the extent of the damage that was done. And then there's also something called Alzheimer's disease, which is very sad. This is a disease that is most often occurs in elderly people, and it's actually tissue breakdown. And there's a lot of signs of Alzheimer's disease, but you don't actually know if someone truly has Alzheimer's disease until after they've passed away, and you can actually look at the brain and see the tissue that has been breaking down. But there are a lot of symptoms that lead up to this, and can see this happening over time as they start to lose their memory, and eventually this will lead to death. And there's a lot of research being done here, but there's still a lot that we don't know about Alzheimer's disease. So that's the protections of the brain, and then a little bit about some of the things that can affect the brain.